Streaming services. We all like them, especially in this streamlined mobile phone age that we all live in. But if you're a music purist, that starts to become a love-hate relationship, as these small irritations start worming their way into our earphones. Streaming services like Spotify spit ads on top of everything if you have a free account, so the only way to get rid of them is to give Spotify your money.
Want a break from the ads? If you
Shut
tap
up!
now to
Shut
watch
up!
a short...
Go! Go! Sit over there! I'm not paying for your premium! Anyway. Now you may think that it's easy to bypass that by getting physical MP3s, WMBs, FLACs, whatever, and putting them onto your phone physically to listen to from there. And while that is an option, don't forget the fact that it's still your phone, and the music could get interrupted by a phone notification, constant buzzing in your pocket, and the good chances for a text message or a call getting in the way of your more streamlined music experience. And after all of that, I've heard a lot of people who want a new device that can just play the music without any distractions.
Oh, that would be the future.
Well, little do you know, the future is here. 20 years ago. Huh? What? Where did the video file go? Oh, right. YouTube. They probably, blocked the video worldwide, and before even doing that, went back in time to delete the video file. Luckily for them, I backed it up in a link in the description. But for the YouTube upload, I think we're probably going to need to use something different. What do I mean by that? That's probably the first question running through your head. Is saying a quote that looks like this can't just be said without giving a little bit of context. What I'm referring to is the forgotten golden child of Steve Jobs' lifetime as a businessman, the iPod. Chances are, though, that you saw the title of this video, A Collector's Guide to iPods, and want to get into them yourself. And if that's what you're here for, then I'm the kind of person you're looking for. I mean, let's see what happens if you look up people that don't even use them to get their advice. Can I use iPod in 2022? No! Old tech in current year. Don't on the tap, I'm also using an old MacBook in 2018. That literally answered none of my questions. But why am I talking about iPods in the vein of collector's items that are waiting to explode? Well, everyone used to have a Walkman, as that used to be the absolute best way to listen to music portably back in the 70s, and maybe even a little bit beyond that. But over time, as the iPod and other digital MP3 players and even the radio became more mainstream in the 2000s, Walkmans got more obsolete over time, and now if you want a Walkman, despite it being really outdated technology, you'll have to shell out a pretty penny. My guess is that iPods are going to follow the same formula, only this time with streaming services. As nowadays, the whole idea of putting your own specific songs on a device to listen to them wherever you want is nowhere near as convenient as just having a thing that can play every song in the world by just touching it and only requires money. And that's why I think iPods are a collectible that are just moments away from having their big explosion. And going into this video, I'd assume that you have at least base knowledge as to why the iPod is even a thing. But just so I can keep everyone on the same page, here's a quick summary of Apple up until the iPod. One day a thing existed called Apple. No, not Apples or Apple Corps, the Apple Corporation. Try to keep up. Apple was existing for a good amount of time making computers as you do, but then Steve Jobs left the company to move on with other endeavors as Apple as a company was starting to underperform a little bit. And then he left it in the hands of this lovely little crumpet called John Scully, who developed the Newton. And that was... Dingus! Apple was about to die, and then Steve Jobs came back. He came to John and he said, "Whoa, this is quite the pickle," and then started cutting a lot of Apple's current projects to focus on something new.
Hey guys, I know this is very sorry to say, but we're not gonna make the Apple Newton 2.
And his main focus became music players, because back then you had to break someone's legs to get 32 megabytes worth of... The thing that actually started this train of thought was actually Napster's meteoric rise, as it went from a cool program that a group of college friends would share to being sued in court. And then after a very rushed development, the iPod ended up becoming the history lesson of... There's a timeline out there where Apple never rehired Steve Jobs, relied entirely on their existing apps in the Newton, and then slowly faded away, similar to brands like Commodore, Sinclair, and Monorail. But we live in the timeline where they brought Steve back, and with that funding with Apple on the verge of bankruptcy, they released the iPod, instantly bouncing them out of their financial hole into a renaissance of being too big to fail. Looking back at the first ever iPod, it's endlessly fascinating due to how much it deviated from most of its future models. For one thing, the wheel it had was completely physical. No, "oh, you touch it and then it goes where you touch," or "hey, hey, hey, it clicks now." Just a physical wheel that spins where you put your finger. Another thing to note is that it also has no Windows functionality. At all. Like, not even some third-party software to help convert it over. On top of that, this would also be the only iPod to ever have the classic Apple font on the back of it, therefore adding more value to it. And speaking of value, do I even have to explain why this iPod is the most valuable? Because it is. The cheapest price you can find it for is 250 quid for a completely busted one, and upwards of 4-digit numbers to get a new condition one. It's the only iPod to have already become a collector's item rather than being on the fence of it, but still waiting for that big boom. So what if you tried to take a shortcut? Huh. Give me a second. Production team! I told you to use numbers!
Well, you didn't tell me whether you wanted me to use letters or numbers, so I just used both.
Not the point! I said earlier that using numbers gives us more range. Just stick with numbers.
Alright, I'll stick with numbers, but warn me next time.
I should never take shortcuts again. Don't look at me weird for not being ready. You probably weren't ready to get out of bed today. If you were to ask me what the most incremental change in the iPod's history is, I would go with the second gen Nano, with the second gen iPod mini in a close second, followed by the second gen iPod Classic. I'm starting to notice a pattern here. The only differences between this and the original iPod was that the mechanical wheel was replaced with a touch wheel that would later be repeated with the third gen iPod. The Firewire port has a flap now, the back of the case has the modern iPod font, and it's compatible with some old software called Music Match to fix the compatibility. Though this would later prove to be redundant when the 3rd gen came out. In terms of value, the 2nd gen acts a bit like a diet 1st gen, and that reflects in the prices. It's significantly easier to get a hold of a 7th gen than a 1st gen. Oh, hey, this is me from the future. I've just come here because I somehow said 7th instead of 2nd. I don't know what pills I was on that day, but it certainly didn't help. Alright, back to the future. There's a lot of exploding nanos. Bye. Due to the lowest prices going for about the 130 quid mark, rather than anything above 250 for a bad condition one. This may sound small, but the 2nd gen Classic is still the 2nd most valuable iPod out of any of the iPods you can buy. This doesn't include the touches though, because there's no way that's going to hold on to its value for the next 10 years. Mark my words. Now we're moving on to the 3rd generation of the iPod Classic. And you may expect it to be a bit of a small change like it was before, but there's gonna be something throughout this video that you're gonna want to remember. Because for every single 3rd gen iPod that I'm gonna talk about in this video, and 3rd gen specifically, things are gonna get weird.
The no moving parts scroll wheel was so successful that we've made all the controls touch no moving parts.
This is the last iPod of the Peach Fuzz era, where Apple didn't fully know what they wanted to stick with yet. And this was the last redesign they did before they got something they could really strike a groove with. The 3rd gen is the only iPod release that has both a scroll wheel and buttons at the same time. And yet, despite having backlit buttons separate from the scroll wheel, everything is touch. In terms of what the iPod 3rd gen tries to boast, the screen quality was the nicest out of any iPod up to that time, and the storage was unfathomably high for 2003. However, due to Apple's focus to add far more flash to the 3rd gen, this came back to bite them as the battery life got shortened by this decision by 20% at worst. However, inserting a new battery can help alleviate this nowadays. As it stands right now, the value for the 3rd gen tends to jump all over the place. The lowest I've seen it sold for was with a replaced battery and engraving, and trust me, we'll get to engravings later, for only 68 quid. But catching that was lightning in a bottle. It's hard to find a good condition for one anywhere under 85 quid at a bare minimum. And if it's in the box, that shoots it up to the levels of the 1st gen fully boxed. The novelty of this iPod and why the value tends to jump around is due to the fact that when compared to the rest of the iPod Classics, it's an absolute freak show, while also holding some historical value due to being the first iPods that actually fully work on Windows, which still applies today.
And this feature, a lot of people thought we would never add until this happened.
I would say only try to get your hands on this one if you really like the design, like I do. And you see a little bias in the rankings, hint hint. Why didn't it? After the somewhat confusing 3rd gen that separated the buttons and needed FireWire to charge, Apple aimed to fix that with the upcoming generation of the iPod, the 4th gen, which would take everything that the iPod mini did right and combine it with their current iPod Classic to create one of the most widely acclaimed iPods of all time. You know, it was really ambitious for them to plan ahead and put an image of me in that commercial in 2004 when I looked like this. You can now use USB to charge, but you could still use FireWire to transfer songs. This would end up being the only generation of iPod that would also support charging and syncing with both FireWire and USB, instead of just one or the other. On top of that, the click wheel from the iPod mini has been adapted into the Classic line by giving tactile feedback to any press of the button, something that would still be used until the very end of the lineup. If I was to ever recommend any iPod to anyone who wants to start out, my first recommendation would always be the iPod. But if that person either really wanted a classic or they wanted to hold more songs, then the 4th gen classic is the thing I would recommend to them. The price point for good condition 4th gens have gone as low as 35 quid, which is only a little bit more than a 4th gen shuffle. And to any of the Americans in the audience, you can convert it yourself. Despite all of the upgrades that the 4th gen made, one thing it still abided by was that it was all done on a monochrome screen. But Apple aimed to make a shift to colour now that they had the technology. And rather than waiting for the next gen, they were so excited that they released a minor upgrade in between the 4th and 5th gen, something that never happened again. And that would be the iPod Photo. Wait, how do I go back? Think of it similar to going from the DS to the DSi, or the Switch to the Switch OLED. The upgrades weren't super necessary for people who already had the device, but it enticed people over with 2 new additions: a color screen and the ability to view photos anywhere you want. This, in all honesty, was a bit of a silly upgrade to focus an entire iPod on. And a lot of people thought the same way, as the iPod Photo is actually very hard to come by nowadays. And I guess some companies never learn. Nintendo. After the fairly incremental upgrade of the iPod Photo, Apple wanted to give the people something to be excited about with the next iPod coming up, which was something that Steve never thought would be possible, that being an iPod that can play video. But by God, they did it! Oh wow, for your funny little joke, you stuck me in an iPod video. Very clever. Here's your medal for originality. I bet this joke isn't going to be repeated at all. He's on to me! This was a monumental upgrade alongside the absolutely insane amount of storage, capping at about 80 gigabytes for the most expensive model. This also properly brought the Classic into the same OS as the newly introduced iPod Nano was utilizing, officially lifting us out of the monochrome era of iPods. Well, at least until we start talking about the Mini in a couple minutes. The value of the iPod Video is weird, mainly because its value entirely depends on what model you have. If you have a launch model, then the value tends to be fairly similar to the 4th gen and very affordable for people who just want to watch videos on their iPods. However, if you just so happen to have one of the later models with the Wolfson DAC sound chip, then you have something that will sell for even more than the 6th or 7th gen, due to the fact that the 5.5th gen was the only iPod ever made with a Wolfson DAC, as the 6th to 7th gen replaced it with a slightly weaker DAC to help the production of the larger hard drives. And people who are crazy on quality will hark out for them like wild piranhas. Not to say that the quality of the other iPods are bad, they're all fantastic, but the 5.5th gen in specific is ridiculous, if you can notice the difference. At this specific time, the Nano was gaining more and more popularity due to how compact it was and its use of SD cards rather than hard drives, speeding up how quickly it can get things done. And also this funny little thing that recently arrived called the iPhone. I don't know if you've heard of it, it's kind of a small project. However, up until 2014, Apple wanted to give the people who still wanted to use hard drive based devices a reason to stick with the iPod Classic. And boy did they deliver! They doubled the maximum size of the previous generation, they updated the BIOS to make it more lively and enticing, they added cover flows, auto-generating playlists based off your iTunes library, podcast integration, FM radio with an attachment, and even redesigned the front of the case to make it use aluminium rather than plastic to make it feel more premium. All of this contributed into making the ultimate iPod for anyone. It's great for entry-level people who want to get an iPod due to its durability. It's great for collectors due to the prices doing nothing but soar. It's great for enthusiasts who want a boatload of music due to its massive storage. And it's great for experts who want a challenge due to how hard it is to open.
I hate you!
Now, in terms of value, that almost entirely depends on the condition of the iPod, as even an iPod Classic on its dying legs with no hope of the future would still sell for about 59 quid, even more than a good condition 5th gen. The reason why is both because it was the last one that Apple released, and due to its insane storage. The only other iPod in existence with more storage is the 7th gen iPod Touch. And as you can imagine, considering that that's basically a modern phone without the phone, that inherently costs a lot more than the iPod Classic. Speaking of which, I wonder when that thing's gonna come back. Huh. Out of every single iPod ever released, the only iPods that have more value than this are the 1st gen Classic, 2nd gen Classic, and in some very rare cases, the 7th gen Nano. And if you compare it to them, the 1st gen doesn't work with modern computers, the 2nd gen doesn't work with modern computers, and the 7th gen Nano is really, really weird. So, if you want an iPod Classic that can stand at the apex of them all, as well as also being a bit of a big goal to try and aim towards getting, then the 7th gen iPod Classic is your best bet.
Complete!
It should come to no surprise as to why the iPod Classic isn't only the most collectible, but also the most prestigious out of any of the iPods. They consistently have the most storage, the coolest designs, and just the whole idea of holding the thing that saved Apple in your hands is magical. So just imagine if you made it just a little bit smaller. That'll do it. iPods at this point in time are known for how portable and small they are. So imagine everyone's shock when Steve Jobs comes on stage and says, "We're making it smaller."
So the iPod mini, what's it look like? Well, this is the iPod and it's pretty small, but this is the mini, it's even smaller. And it's pretty stunning.
As not only did the iPod mini have a nicer redesign, more colors, and a better battery life, but it also introduced something called the click wheel, mainly because at the time, it was fighting against the iPod Classic 3rd gen, which, if you remember that wheel, was really cool, but also really weird. Also, it just feels convenient to have one hand controlling everything, and I think that was the main motive that they went for, so you don't have to shift your hand around like you're playing DDR just to select all of the settings. In terms of value, the iPod mini is actually one of the cheapest options you can get, and the reason why is really, really interesting. Mainly because it was the shortest lived version of the iPod just ever. Mainly because its whole thing with being smaller would become redundant after just 2 years. And now I'm gonna have to talk about the 2nd gen. And you know what? I will. It's the exact same with a better battery life. That's literally it. So I guess to fill the excitement of this scene, I guess we're just gonna have to wait for something cool to happen. Huh, I was wondering where that went.
A new record!
Everyone was blown away when the Mini came out. And this was due to the fact that it took an already portable product and then squashed it thinner than people could ever think would be possible for a portable MP3 player with as much storage as it had. So imagine everyone's shock when Steve nonchalantly announced that he would be discontinuing the Mini after only 2 years on stage.
It's the most popular iPod, and that makes it the most popular MP3 player in the world. So that's the one everybody's focused on. Well, today, we're going to do something pretty bold. Today, we're going to replace it.
Why would he do such a thing? Wait, hang on. Did he just pull an iPod out of his useless pocket? And that's how the Nano became a household name in the span of a few seconds. The iPod Nano itself goes for a more plastic look compared to the Mini, and removes the rounded sides that it introduced. However, due to this, they had to cut the storage by quite a lot. But due to the many new features that the Nano introduced, such as a color screen and a photo gallery, people didn't pay much mind to it. However, this material that was on the case was actually really easy to scratch, which eventually led to a lawsuit towards Apple due to how fragile the plastic was. Apple going to court over something you can scratch easily. Huh. Slow news day? Before I talk about this thing's value, it's time that I address the elephant in the room. Notice that funny little orange symbol in the bottom right? Well, that isn't just there for show. That's because any iPod marked with this is cursed by something called the black spot. The black spot was caused by Apple's decision to cram the battery underneath the display to make it as small as it was. However, because all of the Nanos used a lithium battery, after a while, these tended to swell up and break when plugged in for the first time in years. And this would press against the screen, creating a black spot and slowly cracking it from the inside out. Some iPods are easier to fix with this than the others, though for those that are affected more frequently, this tends to bring down their value a lot, as you'd have to find a professional to fix them before they're safe to use. And this also includes the first gen Nano, which is why it's really low on both collectability and usability, because no one wants both a fire hazard and an explosive hazard that can also play music. Actually, that sounds like something out of a Bond movie. And to contrast the absurdity of what you just saw, the second gen iPod Nano makes the least changes out of any iPod ever. It literally just changes the outer shell so that it doesn't scratch. That is literally it. Full stop. So again, like what happened with the Mini, I guess we're just gonna have to wait for something cool. I never thought that would come back. What a surprise. Oh, and it's gone. Well, I guess I might as well talk about the third gen now. After replacing the Mini, the Nano ended up being a massive success with both the first and second gen model, due to how impressive it was due to its really small size and its relatively big hard drive, again, for its size. But Apple thought, hey, if we were able to shake things up with the first model of Nano, maybe we can do it again. But there's a problem with that. This has a little case of a thing called third gen. And if you remember something I told you later... Me from the future again. Earlier, I said earlier, it's earlier! If there's an Apple product, and it's the third gen, then things are gonna get weird. Write that down. The design of the third gen takes a lot of cues from the iPod Classic, as it tries to condense the overall design language of the Nano into something more square to fit with the new BIOS that was being worked on with the upcoming 6th gen. This overall made it what I like to call the Marmite of the iPod models, as you either think it's criminally underrated and really like it,
Okay, mate.
or it gives you a heart attack. In terms of value, this one's very similar to the first and second gen, due to the fact that it's no stranger to the black spot. However, the value for this is actually a little bit higher than the previous models for two reasons. One, This was one of the less successful models solely because of how it looked, and that turned off a lot of people from its admittedly way better features. And 2? This is one of the easiest Nanos to take apart. Granted, it still isn't easy because it's based off the iPod Classic, and roll the clip again.
I hate you!
But if you want to repair a Nano for your own use, then this one is a breeze. Compared to what's next. Well done, team! That is how you untrouser press a Nano. Round up next week. The 3rd Gen Nano was an experiment to see how much the design and the internals of the Nano could be changed while still calling it a Nano. And most of the people who used it praised its increase in storage, its UI improvements, and the video playback feature, with one major criticism being the design's massive downgrade. So that was the primary thing with the 4th Gen. It aimed to fix the design and very little else. The 4th Gen had a much sleeker vertical design that was more reminiscent of the generations before it, while still holding a modified version of the OS from the 3rd Gen, so you could get the best of both worlds. However, despite that also being a storage size with double that of the 3rd Gen's max, that's all it had. If anything, the 4th Gen feels like a half step in the right direction, especially compared to the model we're going to talk about next, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. In terms of value, the 4th Gen is one of the cheapest Nanos on the market, for 2 reasons. One is because people see the next generation of the Nano much more fondly and see this one as a redundant one, and also because of something that I don't want to spoil here and will mention on the 5th Gen. I'm talking about the 5th Gen a lot, aren't I? Well, that's because the 4th Gen is kind of a forgettable iPod, so let's move on to talking about the 5th Gen. Yeah, no transition, let's go! The 4th Gen fixed a lot of issues that people had with the 3rd Gen by giving it a sense of identity. So, where do you go from there? Well, the general consensus was that people liked the design of the 4th Gen, so why not add more features to that? And boy oh boy did they add a lot! They introduced an FM radio that was built into the iPod rather than requiring an accessory like the 6th Gen Classic. It could track the way it was tilted. You could shake it to shuffle what songs you were playing. You could track your steps with a pedometer by getting an attachment with some Nike shoes. And it even had a camera built into the device, making it the only iPod ever to both have a camera and a scroll wheel at the same time. Funnily enough, the 5th Gen Classic was planned to have a camera on it as well, but it didn't end up releasing with it. The camera's quality on this is okay, but definitely a relic of its time. Value-wise, this is one of the easiest Nanos to get your hands on, and that's for one big reason. If you think you're good at tech repairs and want to give fixing up the 5th Gen Nano a shot, then it is the final boss of tech repairs. Not only do you have to slide out the internals like the previous Nanos, and if the black spot is pressing against the display, that makes it impossible, but there are so many more small little components which you have to be careful not to cut or break. All of this added together makes for an iPod that you will only ever see enthusiasts use nowadays. Don't get me wrong, the payoff is great. The features on this Nano is incredible. But you have to be a god to be able to repair it. And if you do want to give it a crack, I wish you the best of luck. Now, on a much more positive note, we're finally done talking about the Nanos with the black spot! Woo! Yeah, celebrate! Victory! In 2010, the iPhone craze was already in full swing, leaving iPods to either fade away to the sands of time or innovate in a new and fresh way. So with the classic series out of the question, and the shuffle of this generation destined to crash and burn, but we'll get to that, and boy can I not wait to get to that, that only left the Nano to come up with something new. And what did Apple end up doing? jumping 5 years into the future. The goal of this iPod was to make the design of the 5th gen more portable and small, while still keeping all, or at the very least most of the features that the old model had. But somewhere in the process, the 6th gen Nano ended up being an early predecessor to the Apple Watch 5 years before the first model of it even came out. It achieved this by ditching the scroll wheel, compressing the size to a tiny square with buttons only at the top, redesigning the UI to be more optimized for the tiny form factor the Nano took, and even added a clock app that you can make the default home screen by tinkering around with the settings. Just from this, it's clear that even though the 5th gen Nano was a Swiss Army knife, the 6th gen was trying to be a Swiss Army knife. Out of every iPod released, this is the one that I am most confident will inflate in price anytime soon. It's the only model of its kind, it's the predecessor to the Apple Watch, and it's one of the only kinds of Nanos that haven't been cursed with the black spot. So I'm almost certain that the price is going to spike up at any point in the future. And if you don't believe me, have a peek at the next gen Nano.
I still don't believe you.
What? No, not that quickly. I was going to do a build-up and everything. I guess this does make my job easier though, so sure. For controls, they took a page from the Touches book and adapted a home button. So instead of violently scrolling left to go back to the menu like a mother who doesn't know how to use YouTube Shorts, tap the button and you're back on the home screen. It brought back video playback, though watching it on this screen especially was a far cry from the iPod Classic of even the 5th gen Nano. And it even featured something that no iPod, except the touch button, would ever include again. Bluetooth. And that leads us directly into the value section. Because people really want this model in particular due to two reasons. One, it was the last Nano made, and being the last of something boosts its value in the iPod world, apparently. Two, the Bluetooth was something that was only seen on this Nano and nothing else in the iPod line. This and the 6th gen are also the only iPod Nanos to not be cursed by the black spot. And even if they were, they're actually quite easy to take apart and fix. So the 6th gen is the only Nano that I would recommend to someone who wants to get into Nanos. I still wouldn't recommend diving into a Nano for your first iPod compared to something like the Mini or the Video though. Apologies if I sort of derailed in this collector section though. It's just simply that I've been talking about iPods for like 40 minutes now, and I just want to get one of the explanations done simply. Can I get away with it this once? Yes? Well, thank you. And if you said no, then don't worry. Because I'm behind glass, so I can't hear you.
Complete!
We have seen a lot of iPods today, ranging from the fantastic, to the intriguing, to the experimental, to the weird, even down to the downright bizarre and demonic to repair. But what if I were to add another layer of chaos onto the big fat cake of music spewing machinery? What? How do I do that from here? Well, let me just, Welcome to the Shuffle experience. The Shuffle was the result of a large surprise in what people were using the iPod for, as for the most part up until this point, Apple assumed that the thing people wanted to use was the much easier UI to navigate through the larger list of songs you now had in your hands. But in reality, most people were using it for the Shuffle Songs feature, as that let you play any songs you want in a different order every time, keeping it always fresh, and turning it into a radio station without any fluff that just got to the songs that you wanted to listen to. So it was that burst in popularity and reason that people were using an iPod that convinced Apple to add one more addition to the iPod family for people who just wanted the most entry-level kind of iPod possible. The first gen Shuffle itself looks a lot like a USB stick, because it is, but it also has a play button on it. This play button, when turned on, would pick a completely random song that you had loaded on it, and then shift to the next song when you were finished with it. It was still technically possible to select songs by flicking through every individual song until you find what you want, but this would only get more cumbersome when you add more and more songs to the point where it quickly becomes near impossible. Value-wise, shuffles are made to be for people who just want something that can play music. No bells and whistles, you hit a button and the music starts coming out. And because of that, shuffles as a whole tend to have much lower value than the other iPod varieties across the board. There's one more exception that's a little bit pricey, but we'll get to that when we get to that. The Shuffle was an unexpected hit. It was by far Apple's most experimental model of iPod, and its focus on the primary reason why people were picking up iPods helped elevate this even more. But it was still slightly weird to actually carry around due to it being in an awkwardly thin shape and having the lanyard on its cap to carry around your neck. So maybe the USB stick approach wasn't the best, and Apple thought of a way to cut the middleman out of the product with their next model of Shuffle. The second gen Shuffle crams all of the technology of the fairly long first gen into a miniature square almost 3 times as shorter than it while being a little bit thicker. And how it goes by this is replacing the USB end of the Shuffle with a clip instead, so it can tightly grip onto anything you want it to. Whether that be a pocket on your clothes, a tie, the hole of a shirt, or even your wallet. But wait, if there's no USB, how does it connect to your computer and charge? Well, there's no 30-pin cable, so how does it... Oh, value-wise, they're very similar to the first gen, so I don't think it's even really worth going over it. And if the rest of the shuffles are as boring, then I'm gonna be able to get through this last category in a breeze, aren't I? Wait, hold on, the third gen's next? Okay, that's fair. Apple likes to experiment with their product a lot, but the thing that concerns me is that this is a shuffle. How do you experiment with a shuffle? That's not a shuffle, that's a breeze block!
Got this great built-in clip so you can clip it right on your clothing. And it's the easiest to use iPod.
What kind of eldritch being did this thing take its design language from? Because it doesn't have a single physical button on it. The only way you can control both the song that's being played, the next song up, the pause button, and the volume are all on the controls on your earbuds. Yup, that means if you don't have any headphones or earbuds without the little control thing, you can't use it. Yeah, an iPod which only allows you to use certain headphones and doesn't have any buttons. I also find it kind of funny that when this was presented, this was one of the only iPods to not be presented by Steve Jobs. And that's kinda saying a lot. This is the only iPod out of the entire iPod family, which I would just say is a flat out no. Don't pick this up even out of curiosity, it's just bad. Oh yeah, and it can kill, that too. It was clear to Apple very early on that the new Shuffle they introduced was a bit of a disaster. And I don't know why. So Apple did what they're known to do when a portable device with the number 3 comes out, and pretend it doesn't exist. The 4th gen Shuffle crams all of the technology the fairly long 1st gen... Wait. Hold on, have I already talked about this? That's the 2nd gen! What did they do for the 4th gen? It's the same one! Literally, the only change with this is the battery life and a slight change to the shape. So, you're telling me that Apple just decided to go back in time after they decided the 3rd gen failed because they couldn't... really puts it into perspective how much of a failure the third gen is. If Apple just decides, you know what, the previous one's better. In an age where Apple will never bring back the headphone jack, that is golden. But yeah, basically everything I said for the second gen applies here as well. And after all of that, you're probably wondering which iPods I would even recommend to someone. And if you want, then, I pity for your wasted time. But to concisely break down everything, like I said I would do earlier, if you just want something that can play music without any bells or whistles, pick up any shuffle except for you. If you specifically want an iPod Classic but don't have enough money to burn on an iPod Classic, then either get a 4th gen or a 5th gen if you care about the more nuanced features. If you want the best iPod Classic in general, without really worrying about flash modding or anything, pick up the 6th or 7th gen. And if you want to know why I picked them up, well, there's the reason. If you're a tech expert and you want something that will feel fulfilling to repair as well as being a big fat hobbyist project, then pick up the 5th gen Nano. Lastly, if you're wondering which iPod I would generally recommend to anyone watching this video, my answer would be the iPod mini. It's not even a contest. It's really reliable, it has pretty good battery life, the storage is alright, and if you want a little bit more, it's super easy to not only open, but also to replace the battery and storage for to flash mod it. What? You expected me to talk about the iPod Touch? Well, I don't really count those as proper iPods, as everyone, even me, just sees them as stripped down iPhones that slightly mimic iPods. Hell, if you want me to speedrun them, fine, I will, watch. First one, didn't have an app store, bleh. Second one, the actual first one. It's basically the same thing with a spec bump and the app store. Third one, literally the same thing as the second one, but now it supports wallpapers. Fourth one, actually a little bit of a substantial upgrade, but mostly because it can multitask. Fifth one, weird, it has a strap on it. Bro thinks he's the 1st gen shuffle. Laugh! 6th and 7th, Apple stopped caring. They're good devices, but if you don't care, then neither do I, Tim! And those are all the touches. Kind of small changes from generation to generation when you compare them to the